The moment the Duchess raised her finger, every servant in the room stopped breathing. Not because the gesture was new, but because this time someone was watching who had the power to make her regret it forever. No one knew the quiet maid standing at the far wall was royalty. Not yet. The sound of a cane striking marble should not have carried so far, but inside the grand hall of Ashford Manor, beneath crystal chandeliers and the cold eyes of silent nobles, every tap of Gary Ashford's cane against the floor felt like a verdict being read aloud. He was trying to stand. That was all. Just stand. The new maid had arrived at dawn that morning. Mary Williams, quiet-footed, plain-aproned, carrying nothing more than a small travel bag and a letter of employment. She had been shown to her post near the east corridor and told to stay out of the way. She expected a quiet first day. Instead, she found herself standing at the edge of the great hall, watching something she had not been prepared for. The Duchess was already crossing the room. Her deep crimson gown swept the marble like a tide coming in, controlled, deliberate, beautiful in the way that cold things can be beautiful. She stopped in front of her husband, who sat gripping the carved handle of his cane, pain moving through his leg like a slow burning fire. She did not offer her hand. She raised her finger, and she pointed directly, publicly, without hesitation, at the man who had once saved 10,000 soldiers on the bloodied fields of Silver Ridge. "A duke," Eleanor Ashford said, her voice carrying across every corner of the hall, "who cannot even stand without assistance, should not pretend to rule Ashford." The room went still. Servants stared at the floor. Nobles shifted in their seats. No one moved to correct her. Gary did not flinch. He did not shout. He did not reach for his dignity the way a lesser man might, grabbing at it publicly, performing outrage for the room. He simply lowered his eyes, tightened his grip on the cane, and breathed. Mary watched from the far wall. She had observed many things in her life, many halls, many powerful people in the act of revealing exactly who they were. What she saw in Gary Ashford was not weakness. What she saw in Eleanor Ashford was not strength. And when what Eleanor did not know, what no one in that marble hall understood yet, was that the quiet young maid watching everything from the corner was not a village girl seeking honest work. Mary Williams was Princess Marianne of Eldoria, the king's own niece, sent in disguise to determine whether the Ashford duchy still deserved its place in the realm, or whether the rumors of cruelty and corruption had finally gone too far. She had her answer. The question now was what she would do with it. If watching a decorated war hero, a man who gave his leg for a kingdom, be humiliated in his own home by the woman who swore to stand beside him makes something tighten in your chest. You're not alone. Subscribe now so you don't miss the moment this Duchess discovers exactly who she performed her cruelty in front of. Because the consequences are coming, and they will not arrive quietly. Drop a comment below. Should Princess Marianne reveal herself immediately, or let Eleanor dig her own grave a little deeper first? Tell us where you're watching from and what justice looks like to you. Welcome to the Ashford Chronicles. But to understand why this moment mattered so deeply, you need to understand what Gary Ashford once was. Not the limping duke with the worn cane. Not the man his wife had reduced to a chair at the head of a table, but the soldier who stood on a burning ridge with nothing but strategy and nerve, and turned the tide of a war an entire kingdom had already begun to mourn. This is where the story truly begins. 3 years before Eleanor raised her finger in that marble hall, a different hand had reached for Gary Ashford, the king's. It had happened on the steps of the royal palace, in front of the full assembled court, with banners still carrying the smoke smell of a war finally ended. King Aldrich had descended the stairs himself, something monarchs simply did not do, and clasped Gary's hand between both of his own. "You gave us the victory," the king had said quietly, so only Gary could hear, "and more than that, you gave us back our sons." 12,000 soldiers had marched into the Silver Ridge campaign. 9,000 came home. Military historians would later write that without Gary Ashford's intervention on the third night of the siege, that number would have been closer to 4,000. The enemy had flanked them in darkness, cutting supply lines and driving the royal battalions toward a narrow ravine that would have become a massacre. And every senior commander had called for retreat. Every instinct in the camp pointed toward survival at the cost of ground already paid for in blood. Gary had spread a map across a broken ammunition crate and quietly proposed something else entirely. Not retreat, redirection. He split the battalions into 3 moving columns, using the ravine itself as cover rather than a trap, drawing the enemy's flank inward while the 3rd column sealed the exit behind them. By dawn, what had nearly been a slaughter had become a capture. The war ended within 6 weeks, but Gary did not walk away from Silver Ridge unharmed. On the final night of the campaign, a munition store caught fire near the eastern line. Gary had gone back, against orders, against reason, to pull 2 young soldiers clear of the blast radius. He got them out, and the second explosion caught him at the knee. He never stood the same way again. He returned to Ashford Manor, to a city that cheered his name from the rooftops. Banners, bells, people pressing forward just to touch the sleeve of his coat. Eleanor had stood at the manor gates in her finest dress, radiant with pride, reaching for the decorated war hero she had married. But the cheering fades. It always does. Within a season, the court had found new heroes to celebrate. Younger ones, uninjured ones, men who could stand at full height during royal ceremonies without a cane catching the light. The whispers began the way they always do. Quietly, at the edges of rooms, in conversations that stopped just as Gary entered. A great duchy requires a commanding presence. Ashford needs strength the court can see. It is a shame, really, so he was magnificent once. Gary heard all of it. He said nothing. He returned to his study each evening, lit the lamp, and kept working, because the king still sent him letters, and Gary still sent answers. That had always been enough. Until it wasn't. Eleanor Ashford had not always been cruel. There had been a time, and she returned to it sometimes, the way a tongue returns to a sore tooth, when she had genuinely admired her husband. She had been 19 when they met. Gary Ashford was 31, already decorated, already spoken of in the kind of reverent tones that make young noblewomen lean forward at dinner tables. He had walked into her father's hall with the quiet confidence of a man who had never needed to announce himself, and Eleanor had decided within the hour that she would marry him. But she was not ashamed of that calculation. The nobility understood ambition. Ambition was simply intelligence with direction. She had wanted a seat at the center of the kingdom's power. Gary was that seat. Brilliant, respected, trusted by the crown. A man whose name opened doors that old money alone could not. Standing beside him would have meant standing beside history, and for 2 years it had been exactly that. Then Silver Ridge happened. She had waited at the manor gates for the man she married. And what came through them instead was someone who moved slowly, who winced on stairs, who sometimes sat through entire council meetings because the pain would not allow him to stand. Eleanor had tried, in those early months, to adjust her expectations. She had told herself it was temporary, that the leg would strengthen, that Gary would find a way to reclaim the commanding presence the court expected of him. He hadn't, and the court had noticed. What Eleanor could not forgive, what had hardened something permanent inside her, was not the injury itself. It was what the injury had cost her. Invitations that arrived with slightly less urgency. Conversations at royal functions that moved past her just a beat too quickly. The subtle, devastating arithmetic of a court deciding whether the Duchess of Ashford was still worth cultivating. She had sacrificed her youth, her options, her ambitions on the promise of a man who now limped through his own great hall. That was what she could not forgive. Lord Cassius Vane arrived at Ashford Manor on a grey Tuesday morning, unannounced to most of the household, announced only to Eleanor. And he was a narrow man with careful eyes and the practiced warmth of someone who had spent decades meaning none of it. A northern noble with old land, new debt, and significant interest in the question of who would govern Ashford if Gary were deemed unfit to continue. Eleanor received him in the east drawing-room, not the main hall, not any room where servants moved freely, or so she believed. Mary Williams had been assigned to lay the fire in the adjoining corridor that morning. The door was heavy. The walls in Ashford Manor were stone and old and carried sound in unexpected directions. Mary kept her movements quiet and her expression empty, the way she had been trained to do in situations precisely like this one, where the value of the information depended entirely on no one realizing she was collecting it. She caught fragments. Enough. The king grows sentimental about old loyalties. Vane's voice, smooth and low. But sentiment does not govern, demonstration does. The council meeting last week was sufficient demonstration, Eleanor replied. Half the room saw him unable to rise. Half the room is not the crown? A pause. Give it time, Eleanor said. By the winter assembly, there will be no question left to ask. Mary set down the fire iron carefully and rose. She did not hurry. She did not change her expression. She walked back down the corridor the way any new maid would, purposefully, invisibly, with the quiet efficiency of someone who understood their place. But her mind was already composing the letter she would need to send. The duchy wasn't simply struggling under the weight of a duchess's contempt. It was being dismantled, piece by piece, and deliberately. And the man at the center of it all was still in his study, lamp-lit, writing strategies for a kingdom that didn't yet know how badly it needed him to survive this. Let's pause for a second. A man gives his leg defending a kingdom, and the very people who draped banners for his return are now meeting in back rooms to replace him. If this story reminds you how quickly loyalty disappears the moment power shows a crack, subscribe now, before the truth fully surfaces. Because what Eleanor doesn't know is that someone inside this manor is already reporting everything directly to the crown. Every word, every meeting, every name. And if you're still on the fence about subscribing, answer this honestly in the comments. Does Gary Ashford deserve what's being done to him? Your answers might surprise everyone reading. Gary Ashford's study was the one room in the manor that felt like him. No performance, no marble, no chandeliers engineered to impress visitors into submission. Just walls of books that had actually been read, maps pinned with the careful precision of someone who still used them, and a desk worn smooth at the edges from years of honest work. Mary was assigned to it on her third morning. She came in quietly, as she came everywhere, with a tray, a small pot of tea, and the unhurried manner of someone who had learned long ago that people reveal themselves most completely when they believe they are not being observed. Gary was already at his desk. He did not look up immediately, which she noted. Most men of his rank acknowledged servants the way they acknowledged furniture, only when something was out of place, till he looked up when she set the tray down. "Thank you," he said, simply, without theater. Mary kept her eyes appropriately lowered and began arranging the cups. Then, after a beat of silence that she had calculated carefully, she spoke. "Forgive me, Your Grace." Her voice carried the soft hesitation of a girl unused to grand houses. "Is it true you commanded at Silver Ridge?" Gary looked at her. Not with irritation, with the mild curiosity of a man surprised by an unexpected question from an unexpected direction. "It is," he said. "My brother served in the Eastern Battalion," she continued, still not quite meeting his eyes. "He said the flanking strategy on the third night was the reason he came home." A pause. Something shifted in Gary's expression. Not pride, exactly. Something quieter than that. "Many men made that night possible," he said. "Your brother among them, I'm sure." She refilled his cup and let a moment pass before she asked the next one. "Do you think a leader who cannot be seen to be strong can still lead, Your Grace?" The question landed differently than the first. She felt him notice it. He was quiet long enough that a less disciplined observer might have retreated, apologized, smoothed it over. Mary simply waited. "That depends," Gary said finally, "on what you believe strength is for." He turned back to the document in front of him, but he continued speaking. Not performing, just thinking aloud in the way people do when they have stopped expecting to be truly heard. Strength that exists to be seen is pageantry. Strength that exists to protect, that can live in a great many forms, some of them quiet. Mary said nothing. She set the empty tray against her hip and moved toward the door. "What is your name?" Gary asked. "Mary, Your Grace." "Thank you, Mary." A pause. "For the tea. And the question." She dipped her head and stepped out into the corridor. She stood there for a moment in the cool quiet of the hallway, longer than she needed to. In 3 days inside Ashford Manor, she had watched a man be publicly stripped of his dignity by the woman sworn to stand beside him. She had overheard a conspiracy being assembled in a drawing room he was never invited to enter. She had seen the court treat his injury as evidence of some personal failure, and now she had sat, effectively, across a desk from him and asked him questions designed to find the cracks that justified all of it. She had not found any, and what she had found instead was a man who thanked the maid who brought his tea, who remembered the names of other men's battalions, who knew the difference between performing power and quietly bearing it. He is still exactly who the king believes him to be, she thought, which means what is happening in this house is not a failing of leadership, it is a betrayal of it. The second meeting happened 4 days later. Same drawing room. Same hour. Late enough that the household had thinned, early enough that candles still burned in the main corridors. Lord Cassius Vane arrived again through the side entrance, the one that faced the garden and did not pass the guard's post. Mary had noted the route on his first visit. She had made sure to be assigned to the linen cupboard at the end of the adjoining hall before he arrived. But Eleanor did not waste time on pleasantries. "The winter assembly is 6 weeks out," she said. "That is our window." "The king will need more than one poor council showing," Vane replied. "He is sentimental about Ashford. We have established this." "Then we give him something he cannot be sentimental about." Eleanor's voice was steady, not heated, not nervous. The voice of someone who had been rehearsing this particular conversation in her own mind for a very long time. A duchy requires active governance. Letters sent to the capital are not governance. A man who cannot stand at his own assembly table, who sends his strategies through couriers like a pensioner writing from the countryside. That is not a duke. That is a memory the court is too polite to bury. A pause. "There are 3 lords on the Northern Council," Vane said, "who have already indicated they would support a formal petition to the Crown requesting review of Ashford's leadership. If a 4th were to sign, someone with credibility beyond political ambition, I will handle the 4th, Eleanor said. Silence. Then Vane, quieter, and Gary himself. Gary, Eleanor said, will do what he always does. He will be dignified. He will be restrained. He will make no scene and offer no resistance because he believes, genuinely, absurdly, that the right thing done quietly is still the right thing. A short pause. That is why he will lose. In the linen cupboard, Mary stood completely still. She had stopped pretending to count sheets 2 minutes ago. What she was hearing was no longer the bitter grievance of a dissatisfied wife, and it was not even the maneuvering of an ambitious woman trying to reclaim influence she felt she was owed. It was a coordinated effort to remove a loyal duke from power, structured, timed, with named parties and a planned petition to the crown. In the kingdom's legal language, there was a word for subjects who organized to undermine a duke appointed and trusted by the king. It was not a comfortable word. Mary's hand found the small fold of her apron where she kept paper and a writing stick. Tools a village maid would have no use for. Tools a royal investigator never traveled without. She began writing in the dark, by memory, from the beginning. Every name, every word. Gary Ashford had no idea what was being constructed around him, but the Crown was about to find out. Mary had been trained to observe without conclusion. Gather first, interpret later. Let the evidence accumulate until the picture it forms is undeniable. Not because you want it to be true, but because it simply is. She had applied that discipline carefully inside Ashford Manor. She had not allowed Gary's quiet dignity in the great hall to become evidence of anything beyond self-control. She had not allowed his words in the study to become proof of anything beyond intelligence. One moment of restraint and one thoughtful conversation did not make a man worthy of a duchy. What she witnessed over the following week began to make the case that no single moment could. It started on a Wednesday morning. A young stable hand named Pell had caught his arm badly beneath a fallen gatepost. A clean break, the manor physician confirmed, but painful enough that the boy had gone grey in the face by the time they brought him inside. Eleanor was entertaining a guest in the front salon and had instructed the household not to disturb her with staff matters. Gary heard the commotion from his study. He came down the east corridor himself, moving carefully on his cane, and found Pell sitting on a bench in the servants' passage, with his arm bound and his eyes glassy with pain and embarrassment. Gary sat down beside him, an act that cost him something. Mary could see it in the brief tightening of his jaw as his injured leg bent, and spoke to the boy in a low, even voice until the color began returning to his face. He stayed until the physician had finished. He told Pell he would receive his full wages during recovery. He said it quietly, as a statement of fact, and not a performance of generosity. Then he rose, gathered himself, and went back to his study without mentioning it to anyone. Mary added it to her notes. The veterans came on Fridays. Not formally. There was no ledger, no announced arrangement. But Mary had noticed that a small side door near the kitchen garden was left unlatched on Friday mornings, and that men arrived there, 2 or 3 at a time, always quietly, and left again within the hour. She positioned herself near the kitchen garden on the 3rd Friday and watched. They were soldiers, old ones mostly, men carrying the particular posture of people whose bodies had been used hard and not recovered well. Missing fingers, a man whose left eye had been replaced by scar tissue, another who walked with a limp that mirrored Gary's own. Gary met them himself. No steward, no intermediary. He knew their names. He asked after specific injuries, specific families. He pressed folded notes into their hands. Money, she confirmed later, after a quiet conversation with the kitchen boy who swept the garden path. Not small amounts. None of it was recorded anywhere in the manor accounts. The letters to the capital she already knew about, but she had not understood their full weight until she gained access, carefully, briefly, to the copies Gary kept in the lower drawer of his desk. They were not ceremonial correspondence. They were not the polite dispatches of a man maintaining appearances. They were working documents, detailed assessments of border vulnerability, supply chain weaknesses in the northern routes, like updated intelligence on the mountain passes that had nearly cost the kingdom everything at Silver Ridge. Strategic thinking that was, in Mary's informed estimation, significantly sharper than anything currently being produced by the 2 generals who had formerly replaced him. The king was not receiving these letters out of loyalty to an old friend. He was receiving them because he needed them. That evening, Mary sat in her small room at the end of the servants' corridor, lit a single candle, and wrote the most important document she had composed since arriving at Ashford Manor. Not a record of conspiracy this time, not a list of names and meeting times and overheard sentences. A confirmation. Gary Ashford is not a broken man awaiting replacement. He is an active and essential servant of this crown, being systematically undermined by those closest to him. The duchy does not need to be rescued from its duke. It needs to be rescued for him. She sealed it with wax. No signature, no crest, not yet. She passed it to a rider she trusted before dawn. Right here is where most people would break. Humiliated in his own hall, plotted against in his own home, forgotten by a court he bled for. Gary Ashford just keeps going, quietly, steadily, protecting the people who doubt him and serving a kingdom that hasn't yet realized it's still depending on him. If that kind of story moves something in you, the ones about people who hold the line when no one is watching, subscribe now before justice finally arrives. Because in just a few chapters, someone inside this manor is going to step forward and reveal a truth that will make Eleanor Ashford wish she had chosen silence over that pointed finger. And if you've been watching this whole story unfold without subscribing, tell us honestly in the comments. Why wait? The announcement arrived on a Thursday, sealed with the royal crest. A formal banquet. Ashford Manor, 10 days hence. Attendance expected from all senior noble houses in the Northern Duchy. Representatives of the Crown would be present to observe the state of regional governance. Eleanor read the letter twice. Then she smiled. The particular smile of someone who believes fortune has finally decided to cooperate. She had been waiting for precisely this. An audience, a formal one, sanctioned by the Crown, with every relevant noble in attendance. And a room full of people with influence and long memories assembled to take the measure of Ashford's leadership. She began planning before the seal had cooled. The preparations consumed her completely. Guest arrangements, table placement, the careful choreography of who would be seated where and within earshot of what. She ordered new candelabras for the great hall. She commissioned a menu designed to impress visiting dignitaries. She selected Gary's chair for the head of the table herself. A tall, formal seat that would make his difficulty rising from it plainly visible to everyone present. Every detail was a brushstroke in a portrait she had been composing for months. By the time the duchy was finished, the room would tell its own story. She did not consult Gary on any of it. Gary received the news quietly. He read the letter, set it on his desk, and returned to the document he had been working on. If he understood what Eleanor was preparing around him, and Mary suspected, watching him from the doorway of the study that afternoon, that he understood it completely. He gave no indication of alarm. He simply worked. He had, Mary noted, been sending more letters to the capital in the past week. Longer ones. She had not been able to read them, but the frequency told her something. He was not unaware. He was waiting, too, for something she had not yet been told about directly. Something arriving on its own schedule. The night of the banquet came cold and clear. The great hall had been transformed. Candlelight moved across the marble in warm columns. The long table was set with the manor's finest silver and the kind of deliberate formality that announces this matters before a single word is spoken. Nobles arrived in careful succession, trading greetings with the studied warmth of people who had all received the same private assurances from different sources. Eleanor stood near the entrance in deep burgundy silk, composed and radiant, receiving guests with the practiced ease of someone who had rehearsed this exact moment in her mind many times. She was, by every visible measure, entirely in control. Gary sat at the head of the table. He had dressed formally. Dark coat, the small, undecorated military pin he always wore, nothing more. He spoke when spoken to. He listened more than he talked. He thanked the footman who refilled his glass. Eleanor watched him from the far end of the table, and waited. The royal guards arrived an hour into the evening, not the standard ceremonial escort that accompanied official observers to provincial events. These were household guards, 6 of them bearing the king's personal livery, moving with the particular purpose of men on a specific assignment rather than a general one. the room noticed. Conversation softened. Heads turned. Eleanor's composure flickered for just a moment. Something between surprise and recalculation passing across her face before she recovered it. At the far end of the hall, near the ceremonial chair that had been placed for the Crown's representative, Mary Williams stood with her hands folded in front of her apron. She had stood in corners of rooms for nearly 2 weeks, quietly, patiently, with the practiced stillness of someone accustomed to waiting for the right moment. But something about her posture tonight was different. She was no longer watching the room. The room was beginning to watch her. It began with silence. Not the natural silence of a room between conversations, the kind that fills and empties without anyone noticing. This was the other kind, the kind that spreads from a single point outward, moving table to table as eyes follow something they cannot immediately explain. Mary had taken 3 steps away from the wall, that was all. 3 steps into the open floor of the great hall, away from the corner she had occupied for the better part of 2 weeks. But something in the quality of those steps, the straightness of her spine, the deliberate unhurrying of them, made the nearest footman stop mid-paw. Eleanor noticed from the far end of the table. Her brow drew together slightly. A servant stepping out of position was a minor breach, easily corrected. She opened her mouth to speak. Mary reached up and untied her apron. She folded it once, neatly, with the calm of someone who has rehearsed nothing because they need to rehearse nothing, and set it on the empty chair beside her. The 6 royal guards moved simultaneously, not toward her, but to formation around the room's perimeter, positioning themselves at every exit with the practiced precision of men executing a prearranged instruction. The nearest noble pushed back his chair. Someone at the middle of the table said something low and urgent to the person beside them. And then the guards knelt, all 6 of them, in unison, heads bowed, and the room did not so much go quiet as it simply stopped. Glasses half raised, sentences half finished. Every eye in the great hall converging on the young woman standing in the center of the floor in a grey maid's dress, without her apron, with a posture that suddenly made the marble hall feel like it had been arranged around her. Eleanor had gone the color of cold ash. Gary Ashford stared. Mary, Princess Marianne of Eldoria, the king's niece, 3rd in the order of royal succession, lifted her chin and spoke. "You may stop pretending, Duchess Ashford." Her voice carried without effort, clean and even, filling the hall the way a voice does when it has never needed to raise itself to be obeyed. The Crown has seen enough. The silence held for one more moment. Then Eleanor said, very quietly, "So that is not possible." "I have been in this house for 17 days, Marianne continued, moving her gaze slowly around the table. "Not accusing, simply accounting. I have observed the governance of this duchy, the conduct of its leadership, and the character of those who hold its trust." A pause. "I have also observed considerably more than that." She spoke plainly. No theatre, no relish in it. She described the great hall on her first morning, the pointed finger, the public declaration, the room full of people who had said nothing. She recounted Lord Vane's 2 visits to the East drawing-room, the words exchanged, the petition being assembled, the names she had written down in the dark. She spoke about the veterans at the side door on Friday mornings, the stable boy with the broken arm, and the letters to the capital that had been quietly shaping the kingdom's defense strategy while their author was being dismissed as a man too broken to stand. She said all of it without looking at Eleanor. She was looking at Gary. He had not moved since she began speaking. He sat very still at the head of the table, one hand resting on his cane, his expression carrying something that was not quite shock and not quite recognition. Something between the two, the look of a man hearing confirmed what he had never allowed himself to fully believe. That someone had been paying attention, that it had mattered, that he had not in fact been invisible. At the far end of the table, Eleanor Ashford's carefully constructed evening. Every candle, every placement, and every choreographed detail designed to finally bury her husband before the right audience collapsed around her without a single thing being moved. The audience she had so carefully assembled had just watched everything she had built turn against her. In her own hall, at her own table. Before the crown she had counted on to finish what she started. No one spoke for Eleanor. That was the thing she would remember longest in the months that followed. Not the words of the princess, not the kneeling guards, not the faces of the nobles she had cultivated so carefully, turning carefully away. It was the silence where a defense should have been. The absence of a single voice in that hall rising to say, "Wait," or "There is another side," or "Let her explain." She had spent years building alliances in that room, and every one of them held their tongue. Princess Marianne turned to face the assembled table fully. What she said next, she said slowly. Not for effect, but because she wanted every word to land in the right order, to be understood rather than simply heard. "I was sent to this duchy by the king to answer one question." She paused. Whether the Duke of Ashford still possessed the judgment and character worthy of the crown's trust. She looked at Gary. "I have my answer." She reached into the fold of her dress and produced a document. Small, already sealed, the kind that arrives with its conclusions already decided before anyone in the room has spoken. She set it on the table in front of the nearest guard. The king's reaffirmation of Gary Ashford's authority over this duchy, prepared in advance of this evening, until pending confirmation of what I found here. A brief pause. "I am confirming it." The guard carried the document to Gary. Gary did not open it immediately. He set it flat on the table in front of him and was quiet for a long moment. Then he looked up at Marianne. Not with triumph, not with the vindicated anger of a man whose patience had finally been rewarded, with something simpler and harder to perform than either of those things. Gratitude, plain and unguarded. "Your Highness," he said. His voice was steady. "I don't know what to—" "You don't need to," Marianne said quietly. Then, to the room. What you witnessed in this man over the past months was never weakness. It was restraint. It was the discipline of someone who understood that his conduct reflected on this duchy, on its people, to get on the crown, even when those around him had forgotten the same obligation. She let that settle. Then, clearly, for the record, for the room, for every noble who would carry these words back to every court they attended for the rest of their careers. A ruler's strength is not measured by the strength of his body. It is measured by the strength of his honor. Lord Cassius Vane was escorted from the hall before the evening ended. 2 others at the table left with him, men whose names had appeared in Mary's notes, whose quiet assurances to Eleanor had formed the architecture of what the Crown's investigators would spend the next several weeks formally examining. The petition to replace Gary was reviewed, documented, and buried, and the noble houses that had signed it received correspondence from the capital that they did not discuss publicly afterward. Eleanor was not arrested. The Crown was precise about such things, measured, deliberate, giving disgrace its proper shape without excess. But she was formally removed from any role in duchy governance, and the manner of her removal was not private. Courts talk, letters travel. By winter, the story of what she had done, and what it had cost her, was known in every noble house that mattered. She had wanted the room to witness her husband's failure. Instead, they had witnessed her own. The hall emptied slowly. Gary rose last. He gathered himself the way he always did, unhurried, without apology, without performance. He reached for his cane. He stood, and then he walked. The same walk it had always been, measured, deliberate. The slight unevenness that the explosion at Silver Ridge had made permanent, that nothing would ever fully correct, that the court had spent months treating as a verdict on his fitness to lead. But this time, as he moved across the marble floor toward the corridor, something in the room shifted. A noble near the door stood. Then another. Then, one by one, Without instruction, without ceremony, every remaining person in that hall rose to their feet and stayed there, silent, upright, until Gary had passed. He did not stop. He did not look back. But Marianne, standing near the entrance, watched his shoulders settle as he moved through the doorway. The faint release of a man who had carried something heavy for a very long time and had finally, quietly, been permitted to set part of it down. And the cane still struck the marble on the way out. It always would. But no one in that hall would ever again mistake the sound of it for weakness. True strength had never left Ashford Manor. It had simply been waiting for the room to remember how to recognize it. This story ends here. But what it leaves behind doesn't. The reminder that sacrifice deserves to be remembered. That humility is not the absence of power. It is power choosing patience. That arrogance, no matter how carefully dressed or strategically placed, always finds its way to the center of the room it tried to control. Gary Ashford never stopped being worthy. The court simply needed someone brave enough to say it out loud. If this story meant something to you, subscribe, share, and leave a comment below. Tell us, which moment hit hardest? The great hall on the first morning? The veterans at the side door? Or the moment every noble in the room stood without being asked? We read everyone. Thank you for watching.